Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we are diving into, well, it's something I've always found super interesting, the different ways Christians worship, specifically, focusing in on the Orthodox Church.
Okay.
You know how when you look across the different Christian traditions, you see such a huge variety in the services and stuff. So we are going to be looking into, where those different approaches came from and what we can learn from them. That's what we are setting out to discover.
Right. And you sent me some sources here that look at both the historical development of this
Yeah.
and also kind of the modern day implications of these different forms of
Yeah.
worship. So I think a good place to start would be to define what these liturgical rites are.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially just specific structures or ways that different Christian communities worship. And the mission of this deep dive, I guess, is to look at, where do those come from historically? Why are there so many different ones? And what are the conversations that are going on today, especially within the Orthodox world, about their relevance? And looking at the material you sent me here, we are going to be looking at the Byzantine Rite, the historical rites, the connection between schism and liturgical diversity, arguments in favor of diversity,
Mm-hmm.
the Antiochian Western Rite, options for developing Western Orthodox rites, critiques of liturgical arguments,
Okay.
old Rite Russian Orthodoxy,
Okay.
and then kind of personal experience and perspective. That's kind of the outline of what we are going to be looking at.
Okay, sounds good. So let's just start off with kind of the baseline. It seems like the foundation for the vast majority of Orthodox Christians worship is this thing called the Byzantine Rite.
Right.
The materials you've given me seem to emphasize just how widespread it is.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, for most Orthodox Christians around the globe, the experience of worship is remarkably consistent, and that's really due to this Byzantine Rite. Now, within the Byzantine Rite, there are a couple of different liturgical services. The main ones are the liturgies attributed to St. James, St. Basil, and St. John Chrysostom.
Right.
The one that you are most likely to encounter in any Orthodox church today is the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple of reasons for this, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Some people say it's because it was, shorter and more practical.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it was just more adaptable for wider use in the expanding Byzantine Empire, and so that's kind of,
So it won out in the end.
yeah, won out in the end.
It's interesting to think that, across all these different cultures and countries, it's so consistent. The source material even mentions that, before calendar changes, there was even uniformity in terms of when celebrations occurred. It really paints a picture of this kind of shared practice for, the global Orthodox community.
Yeah, there's an incredible shared spiritual inheritance there,
Yeah.
and liturgical inheritance for millions and millions of people. But it's also important to remember, I think, as the sources point out, that this wasn't always the case.
Right.
In the early centuries of the church. There was a much broader spectrum of liturgical expressions.
Right. This historical diversity of rites that's being talked about is really eye-opening, and it seems like a lot of it had to do with kind of very human things like ethnicity, culture, language.
Right.
It makes sense that different communities would naturally find ways to express their faith that resonated with
Right.
kind of their understanding of the world.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't, early Christianity wasn't just this monolithic thing in terms of worship. It was much more,
Right.
a tapestry of different cultures.
Exactly. And it wasn't like they were just kind of slight variations.
Yep.
They were distinct, fully developed liturgical traditions. And they really reflected the kind of the unique character of the different Christian communities.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is that many of these early rites, they continue to be used today, although often by Christian groups that the Orthodox Church would consider to be outside of its communion. The source material kind of uses the term schismatic or heretical.
Right.
But think about that. These are living links back to the early church, even if they are, in these kind of separated communities.
It's really important to highlight, traditions like the Armenian Rite, West Syriac, East Syriac, Oriental. And it shows you that, breadth of practice that existed early on. The material even gives some examples of how some of these evolved, like, the Ethiopian Rite developing out of the old Alexandrian Rite, or how the Latin Mass has roots in, pre-Chrysostom Greek liturgy. Makes you wonder, what's the significance of having one dominant rite today when there was such variety back in the early days?
Yeah, it really raises a question about, the nature of unity and diversity in the church's worship. And if you connect this with kind of the bigger picture, the sources seem to suggest that there's a really strong connection between the development of these different rites and the schisms that have divided the church. And it wasn't just about theological disagreements.
Right.
Often cultural and linguistic differences played a really big role in these separations. And because liturgy is such a core expression of faith, the fact that different liturgies developed within these kind of separated groups probably, solidified those divisions.
So the idea is that when these national groups or cultural groups separated, often, because they didn't agree with a foreign power that was representing orthodoxy, that was culturally different from them. The fact that they had these different liturgical traditions kind of further solidified that division.
Yeah, it was a badge of their separate identity.
Yeah.
And the source even goes so far as to say that this liturgical diversity in many ways is a consequence of heresy and separation from what it calls the singular Church of Christ.
Yeah, it's a
and what it means by that is both liturgical
strong statement
and theological divisions.
Yeah,
it's saying that the liturgical divergence is not just kind of a neutral cultural phenomenon. It's actually deeply intertwined with the Church's divisions. That's a pretty strong assertion.
And it sounds like that's kind of coming from one specific viewpoint, right? Because the material you've given me also presents an alternative argument, which says, hey, this is actually a good thing. That this diversity of rites actually points to the truth of Christianity because it's able to, take root in so many different ways.
Right, exactly. That Christianity's ability to be adopted indigenously by diverse peoples and expressed in so many different ways, through these various rites, actually points to its universality and its truth.
Right.
The rationale here is that different cultures, African, Western European, Oriental, whatever, they have different needs, different ways of looking at the world. So their expression of faith is naturally going to differ.
Right. It's almost like you are taking the same faith, but expressing it through kind of lens of your own culture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the argument here is that these different rites can and should exist.
So long as they remain theologically consistent with the fundamental doctrines of the faith.
Right.
It's a view that really emphasizes, inculturation, the faith becoming truly native to different people.
And it's this tension then between, unity and
there's that tension.
Diversity of expression. Yeah. And we see this really come into play with the Antiochian Western Rite that's mentioned in the material.
Okay.
So what's the background on this? This seems to be like a modern attempt to kind of navigate that tension that we were just talking about.
Yeah, what's fascinating about the Antiochian Western Rite Vicariate is that it kind of arose out of this desire to provide a liturgical home for Westerners who were converting to Orthodoxy and who found the Eastern liturgy foreign, too culturally distant.
They wanted something that was familiar to them.
Right.
So the goal was to create this authentic Western Orthodox expression of worship that they could feel comfortable with.
But the material points out that there were a lot of criticisms, particularly because initially, at least, there was a huge amount of borrowing from post-schism Roman Catholic liturgies and customs, even stuff like church architecture. So the point seems to be that this wasn't so much a revival of ancient Western Orthodoxy as it was kind of this hybrid approach that drew on traditions that kind of developed after the split between East and West.
That's really the main point of contention here.
Yeah.
The critics argued that by so closely mirroring post-schism Roman Catholic practices, the Antiochian Western Rite was inadvertently, granting a certain legitimacy to post-schism Rome, and potentially even blurring some theological boundaries and leading to, as the source says, apostasy and ecumenical understandings. And I think by ecumenical understandings, it means like kind of implying a a closer theological unity
Yeah.
with post-schism Rome
Then some Orthodox would accept.
than perhaps some Orthodox theologians would accept.
Right, right.
And so there was also this concern about the recognition of post-schism Roman Catholic saints and miracles,
Mm-hmm.
which could be seen as compromising
Right.
Orthodox theology.
So it sounds like a really delicate and potentially kind of messy situation trying to bridge those historical and theological divides. But the material you gave me does mention that the Antiochian hierarchy has since kind of addressed some of these concerns
Right.
and is working towards developing something that would be a more genuinely Orthodox Western Rite.
Right. So it's an evolving situation. It's
Yeah.
an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
And the author of the source material, expresses a personal wariness about participating in Western Rite liturgies in their current form.
Yeah.
And the main concern seems to be that there isn't that, continuous historical lineage
Right.
that the Byzantine Rite enjoys. The Byzantine Rite goes back centuries and centuries.
Right.
And they feel that the Western Rite is still too susceptible to change. It hasn't yet established those deep roots in pre-schism Western Orthodox tradition.
So this leads naturally to the question of where should these, Western Orthodox rites come from? And the material gives us kind of three potential
Okay.
sources for their development. What are they?
So the first two really involve what's referred to as the Orthodoxization of existing either Protestant, mainly Anglican,
Okay.
or Roman Catholic liturgical forms. So as we discussed, the Antiochian Western Rite kind of initially drew heavily on the Roman Catholic tradition.
Right.
And the appeal there, I guess, is the familiarity. Yeah.
That it offers to Western converts.
Right.
The second option in this category would be, adapting Protestant liturgies, particularly Anglican ones, which often retain some more ancient structures.
Right. But the source points out that there's a big argument against both these
Yes.
approaches. This idea of yoking unbelief with belief. Like, is it truly possible to kind of infuse these liturgies that developed outside of Orthodox theology and understanding
Right.
with that authentic Orthodox spirit?
Right.
However, the counter argument to that is rooted in this idea of enculturation,
Right.
of making things familiar and accessible to
Exactly.
Westerners.
Yeah. You see this tension again.
It's a real tightrope.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what was that third approach that was being discussed?
So the third option that's presented is maybe the most kind of historically rooted one,
Okay.
and that would be to actually engage in archaeological rediscovery. Interesting.
To rediscover the worship practices of the early Western Church from before the schism,
Right.
and to adopt those as the foundation
Right.
For contemporary Western Orthodox rites.
So they have to go digging around and see what they can find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the author of the source seems to kind of lean towards this approach,
Yeah.
or at least basing Western liturgies on pre-existing proper Orthodox Western rites.
Okay.
He even mentions, the autonomous Orthodox metropolia as an example, where you can experience a traditional Western rite liturgy, although full communion with that jurisdiction may not always be possible.
Okay. So this brings up a really critical perspective on this whole idea of a lost or flawed Western rite. You mentioned this guy, Craig Triglia, and he seems to be arguing that the very fact that a thriving Western rite disappeared suggests that there were some inherent weaknesses within its liturgical and spiritual life that contributed to the Great Schism. I mean, that's a pretty harsh indictment of the whole Western tradition.
Yeah, he's basically saying that the Western liturgical tradition had within it the seeds of heresy that ultimately led to the separation between East and West. But the source makes a good point here, and the point is that the Byzantine Rite also coexisted with various Eastern heresies,
right?
Like Nestorianism, which is a theological view concerning the person of Christ,
right?
Iconoclasm,
right.
which is the rejection of religious icons.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the Eastern Church didn't succumb to these heresies doesn't automatically mean that their
Oh,
liturgy was inherently more resistant to theological error.
right, right. So that challenges the assumption that one liturgical tradition is inherently less prone to
Yeah,
heresy than another.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then the source goes on to say that, while modern liturgical diversity, often does reflect disunity and theological error, this isn't so much because, because of different rites themselves.
Yeah.
It's because of, the adoption of heresy and then the manipulation of the
Right.
liturgy to
Yeah.
express that heresy. So
It can become a vehicle for expressing and reinforcing
Yeah.
theological deviations.
it's not inherently bad, but it can be used for bad things.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And the material here also briefly touches on the Roman Catholic Church and its historical attempt to implement a universal liturgy, and how they face challenges with genuinely converting people in places that weren't Europe.
Right.
And then after Vatican II, this shift to allowing more indigenous liturgies, while this did help connect with different cultures,
Great.
it also raised theological concerns from a traditional Catholic viewpoint.
Right.
Because
Potential for deviation
Yeah.
from core doctrines.
yeah, the source even mentions that the contemporary Roman Catholic viewpoint sometimes seems to prioritize recognizing papal authority
Right.
as kind of the primary marker of being Catholic,
Right.
more than strict adherence to theological
Yeah, more than specifics.
specifics. Yeah, exactly.
So it seems like what the material's getting at is that from an Orthodox standpoint, as long as the core Orthodox theology
Yeah.
is preserved, the actual liturgical rite shouldn't be.
The main issue, it's more it seems like the historical lack of liturgical diversity within Orthodoxy is more about historical
you look
supremacy
at-
than any kind of theological imperative
Absolutely.
against diversity. And the source kind of argues that the fact that the church endured through, huge challenges kind of speaks to the truth of its approach.
Exactly. The emphasis is on the content.
Yeah.
The theological content that's
Yeah.
being expressed through the liturgy
Yeah.
rather than the specific, external forms. And that kind of brings us to another really fascinating example of, liturgical variation within the Orthodox world.
Right.
And that's old Rite Russian Orthodoxy.
Yeah, so this is kind of the continuation of pre-Niconian reforms in the 1600s. And what's interesting about this is that this is a tradition that has endured despite, significant pressure to conform to these changes that were aimed at aligning Russian practices with the Greek Orthodox Church. And for those who aren't familiar with this period, these reforms were basically to standardize Russian liturgical books and rituals based on the contemporary Greek practices, because it was believed that the Russian traditions had kind of over time
Right.
deviated from the original Greek forms.
Right. And what's kind of historically significant here is that Nikon, the patriarch at the time, undertook these reforms in the belief that the Russian practices had indeed strayed from historical orthodoxy and needed to be kind of corrected,
Right.
By aligning them with the contemporary Greek church. But the old believers who resisted these changes, they argue that their older Russian customs were actually more historically accurate,
Right.
that they actually reflected the practices at the time of Russia's initial Christianization.
So it's this clash over which tradition was more
Right.
authentically the older.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. And the source mentions that there was a pretty severe persecution
Right.
that the old believers faced, and they ended up kind of withdrawing into isolated communities,
Right.
sometimes even losing their clergy.
Sometimes losing their clergy, yeah.
It's really a powerful kind of testament to how deeply they held these liturgical forms.
Absolutely. It shows their conviction
Mm-hmm.
about the importance of these forms.
Yeah. Now, in more recent times, there has been this movement
Right.
for some old believer communities to return
To communion.
to communion with the canonical Russian Orthodox Church.
Right. Under the Moscow Patriarchate.
Yeah, yeah.
But the key point here,
Yeah.
as the source highlights, is that their preserved customs are not considered heretical.
Right.
They represent a distinct historical expression of Orthodox practice, but within the same fundamental
All right.
theological
Right.
framework.
Right. So,
So they're not. It's not like they are outside of orthodoxy.
right. It's not they're teaching something that's fundamentally
Yeah.
contrary to Kurt.
But the source brings up a concern that Father Joseph Swedon raises about the use of old rite practices,
Right.
especially with new converts, because there's this worry that it might suggest that older traditions are inherently more true,
More valid. Yeah.
more valid,
Yeah.
and that could potentially undermine
That's
later
it.
Orthodox developments, or
Yeah.
even create an openness to ancient heresies
Pre-Christian
or pagan influences.
influences. Yeah.
It's interesting, this potential danger of kind of romanticizing the past.
Absolutely. And this really underscores, I think, the importance of a proper catechesis and a nuanced understanding of church history.
Right.
The old rite traditions are accepted as valid.
Expressions of Orthodox faith, but to present them as somehow superior or as a necessary return,
Right.
To a purer form of orthodoxy, could lead to a lot of theological confusion,
Right.
and a real misinterpretation of how church doctrine and practice develop.
Mm-hmm.
And so, hence the caution, I think, in kind of encouraging new converts to adopt these forms,
Right.
without a really solid foundation in the kind of the established liturgical norms and the theological understanding of the church.
Right. So finally, the material you've given me actually shares the author's personal experience, which I think is really relatable to a lot of our listeners who might be exploring their faith or are coming to Orthodoxy from different backgrounds. So tell me, what does he say about his personal?
So he basically describes this eclectic approach to Orthodox practice. He talks about using standard Western Rite and Old Rite prayer books.
Okay.
Devotional aids like Listovka, which is a prayer rope, a prayer rug, and it reflects, I think, a personal journey of exploration and kind of a desire to grasp the breadth and depth of the Orthodox tradition.
It's kind of like he is trying to put it all together for himself.
Yeah. He wants to understand it all.
Yeah.
And he makes it really clear, I think, that this personal exploration isn't about rejecting established teachings.
Right.
It's more about kind of independently arriving at the same conclusions.
Yeah.
And that's a really important distinction.
It's like he is trying to, kind of validate it all.
Yeah, and he acknowledges the risks.
For himself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He acknowledges that there are risks, with these poorly implemented Western rites,
right,
and an uncritical embrace of antiquity. But he also suggests that these alternative rites, when approached with the right intention, and within the proper context,
right,
can actually deepen one's personal relationship with God. So it's all about informed exploration within the boundaries of the received tradition.
Yeah.
Not a rejection of it.
Yeah. And the material also touches on this unique context of modern North American Orthodoxy, where you've got all these different communities kind of interacting in unprecedented ways because of immigration. And that presents both a really valuable opportunity to kind of understand truth through these encounters, but also the danger,
the potential danger,
of
syncretism, and
errors like ecumenism,
and perennialism. Yeah. So it really necessitates being vigilant and knowing your stuff.
Yeah, having a firm grounding in
Orthodox teachings.
So ultimately, the author concludes by saying that, well, valuing your own heritage and this broader Catholic heritage of the church, that's a good thing. He says that authentic expressions of rites are best discovered and practiced within their originating communities.
Within the communities where they come from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as Orthodoxy in North America continues to develop kind of its own indigenous expression, familiarity with a variety of customs can actually enrich the spiritual lives of Orthodox Christians and help them to understand the richness of their own tradition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's about recognizing that that richness and diversity within kind of the the Christian heritage, but also remaining faithful
To the core.
to those core theological and liturgical norms of the Orthodox Church.
Wow.
So what we've really seen in this deep dive,
into liturgical rites is this, fascinating and complex journey of Christian worship, from this early church diversity to the modern Orthodox Church, primarily relying on this unifying Byzantine rite, and then,
Byzantine's rite, and then these ongoing discussions and developments about Western and old rites, understanding kind of the historical, cultural, theological currents that have shaped these forms of worship, really gives us, I think, a richer appreciation for our traditions.
Absolutely. And the challenges that Christianity has faced throughout history.
So it's this constant need to kind of balance the preservation of unity with the desire for authentic cultural expression.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, listeners, I want you to consider this. In our increasingly interconnected world, how do we navigate that balance between unity and diversity? Not just in religious practice, but in all aspects of culture and belief. How do we truly honor those unique expressions while maintaining a shared core of values and understanding? It's something for